Thank you for coming, and thank you, Dean Appleby, for inviting me, and Thomas as well, and the amazing talk by Obi last night. Absolutely inspiring. It forced me to go back to my room, miss dinner, and revamp my talk completely. Given that, and also the promises that Dean Appleby has made, those of us who work in development understand well the anticipation gap. Thank you very much. And the kind of the tediousness or the tiresomeness that often communities have when promises are made and can't be fulfilled, not for want of fulfilling, but often from inability and what are too often chalked up to unforeseen consequences. I'm going to maintain that we can see those things today, that we need to see those things today, and there's a way of getting at this. Again, given this inspiring talk and given what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm warning you this may be a little long. You have permission to leave at any point in time. Absolutely, I won't take it the wrong way. Also, as architects, we tend to be very visual. We're used to very large screens. So I made a talk that is used to very large screens. So do not worry about reading anything on the screen. Just assume it's there for your entertainment, and I will do the reading part of it. And then any of the diagrams can be found in other places. Some of this is hot off the press because my work is done in work, which Obi knows so well, that you actually make progress by doing work, and then the reflection on that work. And so from reflection, doing more work. So it's hot off the presses because I was just talking to Tom about my new endeavor, which is a base camp to work on the kind of mountain of complexity. And so it's evolving. I was so taken. I'm going to start by again sharing an intimacy with you, as Obi did. I was so taken by her story about her father and mother, and the way that her father clearly incited her, didn't teach her, but incited her into a responsibility for the world, and a kind of showing her the environment in which to learn how to do that. And then she shared a story yesterday about how when her father died, her mother was sad, I'm assuming, but more sad for her daughter having lost her father. This to me was so impactful because I grew up in the Midwest in the opposite situation. My parents were absent emotionally, absent strategically. For me, family was dinner table where there was a cacophony of silent voices sitting there, and the family for me was untold stories, untold desires, untold needs. So for me, then I turned to the world for parenting. I turned to the world to look for family, and the kind of horizon line of the Midwest was my orientation to always go beyond the horizon line. And at 4, I mean, if parents weren't providing strategic direction, at 4, you can imagine the strategic thinking of a 4-year-old. You can imagine even the strategic thinking of an 18-year-old. It's just not there. So I'm going to suggest that a lot of my journey, which is I'm going to start with, of this expanding practice, was very eclectic. I started where my curiosity took me, and I kept on going. So I started in astrophysics. It's a joke that I missed it in the course catalog. I was very intrigued by more the metaphysics of it, but then I was the notion of systems, and the physics of it became fascinating. I found my way into architecture. That's an interesting story of its own, but I will stop there. I've practiced architecture as an architect very successfully for 30 some odd years. Found my practice expanding because of my curiosity and because I seemed to be good at something that I didn't quite understand, and people would pull me into projects that were challenging. So I'm going to give you a map of the evolving of my new practice. It starts with 3 key projects that were different than other projects of architecture. 2 of them I'm going to talk about. And then what did I learn through reflection with an intent to understand was there generalizability here? That's what's important. From there, I wrote Design Unbound, which was about architecting ways to do more than muddle through. If you know the economist Lindblom's description of how you work on complex problems, is you just muddle through. That's the best we can do. This was written with my co-author, John Seely Brown. And that led to new projects where I now had a more knowledge about what was working and what wasn't working. Some of those were a project in Hodgson, thinking how do you urbanize the rural, not create suburbanity. I worked with a group in Maine, K through 12, a new learning ecosystem, the Association of Research Libraries to design the research library ecosystem, with Jack DeGioia at Georgetown to look at what would a university in 2033 look like. And that led to him starting the whole initiative, redesigning the futures of Georgetown. I worked on, from there, a new Jesuit university in Kenya, and then got pulled into the Party-Rand School of Public Policy for 6 years, working with them, reimagining a whole new school and therefore a whole new practice of public policy for the world today. That was the basis of now a lot of the work that I do. And then above the 60th parallel, looking at if we were to reboot society. One way to do it is to take with what we've got, but we're stuck with people that still see the way they see and do the way they do. So what if we looked at above the 60th parallel, which is a problematic area geopolitically as climate change opens the waters and Russia and China are vying for some kind of dominance of the area? What if we looked at that differently before its future was set within the new parameters that Obi set for us yesterday, and think about what would it begin to look like as a federated? And so I've been working on that for a while. It's a speculative project with very pragmatic roots and needs. And then from there, this led to skilling up, new tools, and now a whole new kind of practice to steer change in complex systems problems. I'm going to talk first about 3 stories. I'm going to talk about Elsi Stemma, which is not my story, but it helped me as a lens to look at my stories. And I'm going to talk about the Asian University for Women and cultural tourism in Guizhou, China, as concrete examples of then what I will talk about more theoretically later. So that's the first part. The second part then is to look at this new kind of practice I've been talking about. What's generalizable, architecting ways to do more than muddle through, and this new practice. Okay? So that's the kind of roadmap of what we're going to do today, and I've warned you. Okay. So I'm first going to talk about dignity and development through 3 stories. The first one not being my own. This is Elsi Stemma, Jose Antonio Abreo's project in Venezuela, which he began in the mid-70s. He was both an economist and musician and Venezuelan, and he decided that he wanted to work on one of the most intractable problems of Venezuelan society, of the poor, which is the loss of their children to the streets. The women, the girls lost either to prostitution or any number of ills. The young boys lost as drug mules, and then if they were successful, in upwardly mobile drug dealers. And for him, this loss of their children was the loss of Venezuelan society. So he decided to create what he's called Elsi Stemma, which was to not just teach, and so on the left you have an image of one of the slums, not just to teach women, not just to teach music to children as an emotional embellishment, as a way to be disciplined, but to actually create orchestras and choirs, communities of children coming together and learning to read each other, learning just like a football team, learning to be together, deeply listening and playing together. And to do this, he started by creating a schoolyard, and every day it was a place for these children to come and to be off the streets. First thing, very important. He did another thing, is it was important that he get them in as young as possible. Well, and there was really no money for instruments when he started, so they created paper child-sized, fully detailed instruments, and the children would take care of these as if they were real. The children would be sitting in an orchestra position with their music scores, and the director would lead them, and they would play their instruments as if real, humming and plucking and making the noises. And together learning to go from individual practice to a community of others, a community of practice in this. The paper orchestra was very important. Over time, this became exceedingly successful. As an economist, he was deeply embedded in Venezuelan society, had credibility, was able to get funds, knew how to manage the government and all of the things he was going through. And as a charismatic leader, he was able to propel this forward. The Simón Bolívar Symphonic Orchestra was built out of this. It's played all over the world. And Gustavo Dudamel, who's on the right-hand side, is now the head of the LA Philharmonic. One of the other members, another person from the school, has become the first chair or seat celloist in Berlin. The important thing he was trying to do was not just to teach music for discipline and emotional benefit, not just to create a community of individuals able to work together, but to begin to instill ambition, to create a vision of a future that had not been accessible to them before, and the desire to do more. And as the school took off, to know that people like Dudamel were where they were was really, really, really critical. But at the same time, it was a system that was extraordinarily adaptable. It was able to move into rural townships. The White Gloves Choir on the right is one of the most compelling stories, because he decided he was going to take on the hardest problem, which were children who could not hear or speak. So he created a choir where white gloves were like birds, and the director of the choir next to the director of the orchestra would not sign, but actually create orchestration with the white hands. And this one woman who's in the front, she now speaks. She's been interviewed. The White Gloves Choir has been all over the world. And she says, when I pull on those gloves, I feel like my hands are birds. So what's important here, the ambition to learn to speak, the desire to do more as she went around the world. Really important thing is, from the scale of individual ambition and envisioning what you could not see, to the scale of the family and the community and the world. The women, the mothers and fathers of the children, they'd have to come with pressed white shirts every day, right? We could talk about the problem with that in terms of a colonial mentality, but the point was, the reality was, one of the parents was up pressing those white shirts every day, also participating. At the level of community, folk songs were turned into music that were played and performed. And so the community begins to participate in things that were not part of what they could see, and ambition began to be part of that as well. The important thing is that this has saved over 500,000 people, young children around the world, probably going on 750,000 today. This is not about fixing Venezuelan society. We can talk about corruption. We can talk about all the problems of Venezuela. This is changing the lives of children. There's 30 countries that have now adopted this program because of what it's accomplished. Okay, so that's story number one. Story number two is one of my own stories, the Asian University for Women in Bangladesh. This was important because this was the first time I understood that agency meant not only designing things, but understanding things in systems, and that one had to expand the design space into those systems, work on them as well, if you wanted agency. So, and then the story I'll tell next is when I was thinking systems from the very beginning. So in 2002, Kamal Ahmed came to me, Bangladeshi, educated in the United States, and I was teaching at MIT, and he said, could you do a graduate studio? I need a master plan. Can you do a graduate studio at MIT to work on the master plan? And I said, Kamal, what do you mean master plan? You're starting a whole new school. Do you have a program? Do you know the pedagogy? Do you know what we're working with? And he didn't know all of that, but he started it, and he had an affiliation with the government, so that in 2004, the government decreed and gave them a site in Chittagong, Bangladesh. And in 2009, which is here, if you know Bangladesh, most of it's flat. Much of it will not exist in probably 20, 30 years. But in the hills, which is just outside of Chittagong, and where there are several rural tribes, is where they decided to put this university. And the idea that he had, and so the government gave them a choice of 3 or 4 sites, and we helped them pick the site, and we went from there. This is the site up in the hills. The important thing is that this was not to be for all women. This was to be for rural and poor women that did not have chance to go outside of the country. And from the beginning, it was to be for 14 different Southeast Asian countries. And that's very important. I'll come back to that later. So the very first thing we did is I said, well, we have to come to Bangladesh. I'm not going to start a project if we don't go there. This is not an abstract thing. So we went to Chittagong. We went out to the site. It was a fascinating site. It had a deep, deep valley and a really steep set of hills that were undulating. We climbed the hills, and we noticed that when you got to the top of the hill, the intimacy of the lower part led to a feeling of empowerment because you could see the sea. And this feeling of empowerment, we decided, was really very, very important. The other thing we did is we decided to do projects in the site with materials. If you know, textile is a big industry for the women in Bangladesh. So between cord and textiles, each of the students created a project in site, a mark on the site to understand the site, and all of them had women and young girls and boys too, come from the surroundings. They just popped up and showed up and came to help, and it was absolutely wonderful. Okay, so we came back from Bangladesh in a trip to India as well to look at some of the water systems there, and began to work on the project. We began to understand the project only by working on the project. And we found over time there was lots of conflicts in the system, like the desire for openness. This was going to be mentoring young women to go out into the world, to work at the World Bank, to go back to their villages and work there. Desire for openness in reality and symbolically, so that Chittagong could come use the library. But also the desire for closure and security. In reality, this is a place where women don't go to a residential college. If they do, there's barbed wire and cut glass on top of 12-foot high walls to keep them safe, or at least perceived safe. So here was this notion we needed to also be physically secure in a difficult region, but also project security. And that was a conflict we began to deal with. So little by little, the project emerged. And then Kamal decided to take me with him to the Gates Foundation and talk about what we'd already done. And so we go to the Gates Foundation, and a friend of mine actually happened to know some people there. And so when I wrote him after we made our presentation, he said, they're not going to fund it. I said, what do you mean they're not going to fund it? This is great. He says, they know it's great. 500 women a year is great, but it's not big enough for the Gates Foundation. And this was a new friend of mine. I did not realize how important this person was. So I chastised him and said, you just don't get it, John. This is not about 500 women a year. This is about if we can do this with Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Islamic women, if we can get a community that's robust, working of these women out in the world and back in their communities, I said, we might be able to change the socio-political dynamics of the region. He said, get me a one-page email to that effect. I did, and we had $15 million from the Gates Foundation 10 days later, and that got it up and running. It is running. The master plan has not been done, but 2009 was the very first class that graduated. So this was a reframing of the vision from educating poor women in a century of women to something even bigger. And that's really important. That's part of how you work on these problems. You find the bigger thing that no one else imagined that really engages them. But it was a vision at 3 scales: empowerment of the individual, engagement with their communities, and building bridges, regionally at best, regionally at least, globally at best. At one point along in the process, we discovered this quote by Tagore, which I will not read to you, but it is there in very tiny print on the right-hand side, which is about the role of the landscape as a medium for contemplation. This is a letter written by the second daughter-in-law to her father, saying, I now see my worth in the world. And this was what helped us pull the conflicts together and work through all of the different parts of it, and a whole series of mechanisms, a whole series of things that do specific work systemically to do more than just architecture. We realized from the beginning it had to be about, so this is just a framework that says individual on the left, community regionally, so that's our three scales, and then the different things we were working with, this network of partners, a pedagogical strategy, a campus design strategy, architectural and environmental issues. So mentorship, we began with the liberal arts. It wasn't just about a trade school, which if you work in Southeast Asia, that's often where it goes first. But if these women are going to be out in the world, they needed the liberal arts, they needed philosophy, they needed ethics, they needed oratorial skills. And then it was to be about internationalism and global expertise, to get at feelings of both empowerment and security. We turned the whole university inside out, not the administration and classrooms on the hill and down, but the notion that you would put all of the students at the center, and like an onion ring, you would surround them with different levels of kind of observation and security. And we used the section for empowerment. Below, inside the valley, were the dormitories. On top were the academic. We used the landscape to form the building because we realized that the one thing these women held in common was the landscape and the climate of Southeast Asia. So instead of creating, approaching the metaphysics from the religious side, we approached it from the human, the spiritual side that went beyond. That came from Tagore. So I'm going to go through these quickly because you probably can't see them. Then it was about living the landscape and creating gardens of orientation. Again, you probably can't see these. We looked at would we create dormitories that would chain together difference. That you had a roommate, but then between you and another set of roommates was a place of water, because we discovered that water was everything. But if you didn't get along with that group, you could go that way and talk to another group or go upstairs. So we literally wove together different possibilities of relationships that a person could have, as opposed to a corridor with two people in a room, and if you don't get along, tough luck next year, right? So this notion of creating layers of intimacy that would expand as the comfort level increased. But the real powerful point was when I invited the woman I'd met in Chittagong, planner, a brilliant architect, amazing collection of saris, to MIT for our final review. And we talked about this notion of water. And she said, you know, the one thing the women in Southeast Asia do is they all get together on Fridays to wash their hair. It's a moment of community. And we realized that water was everything. Water in monsoon is about how do you get rid of it. In drought, you want to keep it. If it's for building community, how do you create moments in which it's there for community, and on and on and on. So water became the element, the pragmatic, communal, and poetic element that pulled the whole thing together. Okay, and these are just some of the images of the way the water moved through the project, which again, you can't see, so I'll move on. And then this notion of creating regional and local network of partners, a network of alumni and recruitment, which is exceedingly successful. This is the most successful thing they've accomplished. I've been there several times for graduating classes. They don't have their campus, but they have this network. Fundraising, mentorship, getting people into the world. The women are out. They're at Harvard. I don't know if they're at Notre Dame yet, but they should be here. They're in the Global World Bank, and they're back in their villages doing really important work. So that was our framework. But this was about more than education. They really talk about this notion of inhabiting a perpetual dynamic of conflict. Not trying to resolve conflict, but conflict transformation. If we're going to be pragmatic about these problems, we have to understand them as they are and see the beast for what it is. And understand that we can't fix it all, but how can we transform it So that here, it was about authentically honoring a plurality of ontologies, of ways of being, and epistemologies of ways of knowing. There are amazing stories that come out of this, some really recent ones during the occupation of Afghanistan, of how there's still conflict in the system within the university. But there are so many mechanisms that they have developed in process to make this conflict teaching and not demand that it go away, to not demand that human nature change. Okay, that's the second story. Third story, great show and an ecosystem for economic and human development through cultural tourism. This was very interesting. I was at Ohio State, the Asian Studies program. That was amazing. And one of the people said, could you please come to Guizhou? Because there's this project in China, which is the government would like to get the money that's in the cities and out to the rural communities. Guizhou has the largest minority population that exists. Most of them are Miao, which is this amazing, they have this, you see a village there, it's hard to see, but the craftsmanship, the architecture, the silver work, the tie-dye, the embroidery, the weaving, the farming, everything about it is really high-level craft. But the Chinese government decided that they wanted to open the villages to tourism, busloads of people coming in to see the villagers do their wine ceremony dancing. And that these buses would come in for about 2 hours, go out, leave lots of garbage behind. So another problem is that most of the people most of the Miao in the villages now are older and younger. The middle generation to sustain their lives economically have moved to the city. So you've got older people and younger people in a role that they themselves called performing monkeys. At the same time, the villages were competing for a small amount of tourists because all of them did these wine dances, so they were competing for a certain amount of. So we reframed this. Can we look at it instead of a conflict and between economic development, get money to the villages, and cultural and environmental vulnerabilities, because they were creating cultural vulnerabilities as well. And instead of this performing monkeys as an extent of interaction, the villages were hungry for the outside world. They have TVs. They don't have electricity. They have it's just, when we went there, it was amazing. And this competition between villages, which was taking a population that had worked together to help each other with difference and making them competitive and making them, they were at each other's throats. So we said, what they have different are different crafts, but what they hold in common is a culture of craft. This is the silver work. It's highly detailed and exotic. Silver has financial value. So they would sell their wood and get silver in payment, but they had no reason to use silver in the villages. So they would turn it into these, I'm not going to call them ornaments, but headdresses and belts and whatever. So this young girl is literally wearing her dowry. But because they don't exchange silver, it's merely it's like math. It's just a banking system. I've got a bigger belt than you, right? So it was really very interesting. The silver work is exquisite. Textiles, weaving, embroidery, architecture, tie-dye. This sustainable, I put that in words, it's not, in quotes, it's not just sustainable farming, it's farming as life. And living farming, and of course animals in that as well. So what we did is I went in, I was called in to see if I could draw up the architecture so that they could prove how valuable the architecture was. I said, fine, I'll do that. But then we began to start moving. So we took the vision for this was to take a simplistic take on economic development as a service sector jobs, making beds, right? And culture as a marketable commodity, and shift it to economic development through human potential development within a thriving, evolving culture. So instead of large volume, mostly nationally targeted with a predominantly performing monkeys take on cultural tourism, we wanted to move it to a high environmental and cultural cost to a low volume, longer stay, higher rate structure, national and internationally targeted tourism with lower environmental impact, higher revenues, and meaningful interaction. And they were losing their crafts because I said the middle generation was going to the cities. And to sell things when the tourists came, they couldn't sell a wedding garment that had taken a mother 6 months to make for her daughter that was getting married. They were doing one-off machined ones in the city. So they were losing and risk of losing their craft as well. So the idea here was to create an ecosystem of villages where you could go in and learn craft and stay for 2 weeks and begin to learn about silver and go another place and do that as well. So we looked at it systemically. We looked at how it relates to the world. How would you get to Great Joe? How would you get to the villages? How far apart are they? We mapped the distance from one village to another. And then we looked at how many people could support tourism. That's the red in a village. These are the different villages. These are 7 villages in this drawing. Each red circle indicates the size indicates the amount of people that could actually contribute to tourism. Then the gray tells us how much tourism could they sustain. How many people could they sustain under this new ecosystem? We looked at what each of the 8 villages would contribute. So these symbols mean things. The headdress with the horns means silver work. The chicken means sustainable farming. So we began to look at what did each village do best and most and would be interested in contributing, and how could that then also sustain and keep them from losing it. We looked at what could each contribute to the system, came up with the idea of an itinerary, from village to village, 2, 3, and a whole series of infrastructure for the platform. We came up with the idea of a hotel school. Instead of each village having some developer come in and build a 12-room hotel, what if houses were sponsoring this? What if we built a regional hotel school? There's none in the world for cultural tourism. That means if you're working there, you might learn a few languages. It's about business and not making beds. So would a hotel school begin to be something that would contribute to the world as a new paradigm for cultural tourism, but also as a place to do more than make beds? And the whole thing was about self-evolving at the pace that made sense. A few architectural elements to get started, if you wanted. We had an environmental approach as part of this. Again, it was about water everywhere. How do you think about that? Updating the tradition, the building traditions, from a very empathetic and critical approach to this, in terms of planning, architecture, material and construction. Told you about the itinerary. The investment in starting 2 model villages, really important, as a way to start and see what's wrong and make it better. This regional hotel school, and the idea of small manufacturing of masonry units. Wood and stone is what things are made of. Those are no longer viable. There was amazing work being done in Shanghai where I was working on small masonry units, which are absolutely gorgeous and environmentally friendly. Do we start a whole new industry to build a regionally designed kind of material for construction that itself would go beyond the borders? And then a network of governing and industry partners. This is where it fell apart. We had a great network of partners, so good, in fact, that the woman who was the dean of the hotel school in Guilin, the major city, was tapped to become part of the government. In leaving us, we lost her focus on what we were doing, but otherwise it was great. Okay. So those are my stories. I'm giving you those because they matter as I begin to talk about a new practice, about how to have agency in a whitewater world. How do we have agency in a whitewater world? So this is the theory part. Okay. I'm going to just give you the metaphor first very quickly. It's very personal. When I was younger, I was like a motorboat. Get me in the water, get my degrees, get me out there. Very curious. I was a very wandering motorboat, but I was still a motorboat. You set your sights, you turn on the motor, you go as fast as you can. I love speed. But there was a point in my life where that wasn't working, late 20s. We all know this, right? Early 30s. And someone gave me a wonderful metaphor. She said, Anne, think of yourself as a sailboat. It's different, right? It's the winds. You need to go take the winds, and you can set course and you tack and you get blown off course and you come back. You have to understand the currents, but you're not stuck in the water, right? And I thought, oh, this is very effective, and I worked with that metaphor for a while. And then the 1990s hit, and this is the world we live in. I'm sorry. It's a whitewater world. It's a world that we're in, like it or not. Things are flowing around us. Sometimes they're nice and calm, and sometimes they're not nice and calm. More specifically, it's a world that's rapidly changing. It's hyper-connected. It's a prodigious flow of information around us, and it's radically contingent. The thing about whitewater is you got to get in it if you want to survive. You don't start in the rapids and the waterfalls. You've got to build skills in this. So having agency in this world means building skills, building experience, not rules and formulas and recipes, building experience and beginning to skill up as you go. We're navigating this shifting terrain, like it or not. You could be the one on the bank that says, I'm not getting in, or you can be the one that's in the water and after a point in time say, okay, now I'm going to get back up on the bank. I'm kind of in between the water and the bank at the moment. But the most important thing is that hyper-connected changes everything. Everything. Today, it's the prodigious explosion of different kinds of connections that digital technologies enable. Connections to finance, to trade, information technology, transportation, biology, disease, and the innovative combinations that follow these and other kind of fast, fresh links that's created a really new kind of networked society. Power is shifting because of this. Networks don't merely accelerate our markets, our news, and our innovation. They revolutionize the nature of power. The bottom up is part of this. This is what was being talked about yesterday. In our modern network systems, instead of a hierarchical structuring of power, we are seeing a shift in which power is simultaneously both broadly distributed, power in the streets, and profoundly concentrated, more distributed than before and more concentrated than before. This shift in power, in which connectivity both amplifies core power and changes the nature of that core power, and creates a whole new kind of empowerment for those who may have been powerless before, is one of the most critical tensions of our adolescent networked age. It's the problem and it's the opportunity. And we heard about that yesterday. As networked individuals, we can do things differently. And the world affects us more significantly. This also means, this connectivity, that we're in an era of hyper-connected problems. We're now tied to each other in ways we cannot see through webs of finance, disease, information. The more closely tied we are, the more vulnerable we become. Networks propagate and they even amplify disturbances. Worse, the more efficient we become, the faster these things propagate, and the faster and spread the dangers. When I was first lecturing, or not lecturing, but having talks, I prefer to think of this as a talk, conversations 10, 15 years ago, I was Chicken Little, get her from the room, right? This is just not going to happen. People see it today. I think we all have experienced it, and it's not just COVID. It's the way COVID, as Obi pointed out, you can track back to 2008. You can track back to the malfeasance that was going on in the innovative design of banking products that put some people ahead and everyone else behind. So the ever-widening and denser net being cast by globalization makes it increasingly important to understand the world as a single organism. All issues are interconnected. There's no special sphere of the environment, no distinct lands of oil, no detached global economy, and no separate issue of public health. John Muir, the environmentalist, said this: when we try to pick out anything by itself, any problem by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Have you ever pulled on a thread in a garment, and in 5 minutes the garment's gone? This is where we are today. And all of these are part of the constantly evolving geopolitical picture of the 21st century. They all have global impact. Hyperconnectivity creates a world of entanglement. We've moved from enlightenment, an era of enlightenment, where people looked back to Rome and Greece for answers, to an era of entanglement where we have to look further and wider, back and forwards. Okay. Here's an example. Every year, the World Economic Forum does its global risks. Well, about 6 years ago, it started not listing them bullet points, but showing them together, putting together the global risks landscape, this is 2020, as interconnected and interdependent. The colors have to do with, is it a financial issue? Is it a security issue? I'm not going to go through the details. All I care is that you get a sense of, yes, those dots are connected by lots of little lines. I don't know if you can see that. It's a spider web that's connecting those things. But then, beyond that, that's what it looks like, the ability to do a report like the Great East Japan earthquake and talk about what are the key other factors influencing it. Global governance failure and critical systems failure. And then unpack that further. What's affecting global governance failure? These are a type of causal map. It's a new way of unpacking problems by asking why, and why that, and why that, and why that. As opposed to, what do I have in front of me on the table that I know, and let me rearrange the pieces. This is about going deeper. Okay, so I said it's about how to engage, how to have agency, influence. So first we need to understand the beast we are dealing with. I'm going back to now this notion of kind of complex problems. At a moment when every action seems to dislodge stones in our precarious terrain, ecologically, politically, culturally, and technology, we are increasingly confronted with complex dynamic events and complex problem environments. These are not just problems. They're not isolated problems. They are environments in where they come together. So Obi yesterday did an amazing job of defining wicked problems, which is what they're called. In a way that was extremely valuable. I'm going to give another way to look at it. So she talked about the fact that there are simple, complicated, and complex problems, and that simple problems are like recipes, and that complicated, if I get it wrong, I apologize, complicated problems are much more like formulas, and you could go take a rocket to the moon with a formula. But when it comes to raising children, it's a different beast. It's really, experience helps, but it doesn't guarantee anything. So I have another way that takes it just a tad further, is that if you start with the notion that there are two states in the world, this is not an indigenous perspective, this is a European, I'm starting from a European perspective, chaos and order, or actually physics, let's talk about that. Chaos and order are two systems, that these two opposing states create two kinds of ordered systems. So you have chaos on the left, where agents, meaning everything in the system, is unconstrained and independent of each other. So all of the particles in the system are jumping around and they're independent of each other. And you can only study chaos through statistics and probability, and those of you who do this probably realize it's kind of futile. The other side of it is you have two types of order in the ordered systems. You have simple order, and I'm going to suggest that simple order is where the system, the bicycle, constrains the agents, the wheels, the handlebars, all of the parts. It tells those things what to do, right? And causality is clear. This makes this happen, makes that happen. And if it breaks, and you have a simple problem, the bicycle problem, you do best practice. You pull in the mechanic, and he does best practice. He knows how to fix bicycles, and that's what he does. Complicated order is different. The system still constrains the agents. Think Tesla. In other words, it still says what to do. The rocket ship, the parts and pieces, we know the causality. It's clear, and you still can use good practice. You just need a lot more people in the room. So really there, the problem was when those people in the room can't talk to each other. That's a social issue, but that's the whole thing. The interesting thing is that between those two, chaos and order, two types of order, right? And then there could be a whole spectrum of things in between simple and complicated. That's where complexity lies. Complexity is a different, it's not just harder, complicated, it's a different beast. It functions completely differently. The system is lightly constrains agents. Think ecosystems, think a rainforest. But there can be something happening with the fungus on the ground that is affected by the weather in Australia, right? So it's lightly constrained. Causality is not clear. You can't model it. All you can do is recreate it. The model is the system itself. And there's no causality to it. It isn't the same kind of thing. You can look for what affects what, but it's much more complex web of interchanges. So you have to look for propensities. This thing tends to happen this way. A child like this might grow up like this if I can do this, right? So you're looking at lots and lots of different variables, and you can look at the kind of propensity to act in a certain way. So what we want to do is we want to take those hard, wicked problems that are in the middle of that zone, and we want to try to nudge them to being less complex. If we can nudge them over the edge of complexity into complicated, then we're home free. And you can do that with these problems. So another way, to say it even more simply, is that wicked problems are complex adaptive systems problems. That's what they are. A system is an assemblage of components that form an aggregate whole. That's all a system is. In biology, that assemblage might be organs, related tissues, and again, the parts are constrained by the functionality. We're not going to talk about the endocrinological system. That's a different beast. In astronomy, it's the physics that holds the planets together. But in ecologies, we're into a different thing completely. An ecosystem is an assemblage of components that form a complex whole, but by the manner in which they are independent, in which they interact with each other and with the environment. Exchanges of interdependencies that are dependent upon all of the other things that one part may be connected to. So it forms a complex whole by the manner in which, I already said this. Onward. Okay. So again, how do we engage? So if we know what the beast is, how do we engage? How do we have agency, influence, impact even? One needs to understand how complex systems function, and we have a whole new science for this. A whole new science for this. It emerged when we began to have, when computation actually began to emerge. Whole new science for that. You need to operate at the systems level of the problem. You need to engage it systemically. You need to take a system of mechanisms, actions, policies, whatever, and get them into the system to steer the system differently, to affect it differently. So we need new tools, we need a new practice, we need a new epistemological lens, and a new ontology. It's really very simple. That's all we need. But we're there. We're getting there. That's the really, really important thing. I don't know if you remember back to 2010. It was a year, devastating year. Things like the tallest man-made structure in Dubai, the 8.8 magnitude earthquake in Chile set off a tsunami that killed hundreds. Standard & Poor's downgraded Greece's sovereign credit to junk. The amazing amount of things that were happening in 2010. I was at a roundtable in 2010, and Tim El-Hadi, the director of the Middle East Leadership Program at Aspen, said, the world just came together too quickly. We have little understanding of its true diversity. I mean, the roundtable was very interesting. People were just throwing their hands up in the air. I mean, some of the most intelligent people in the world were just throwing their hands up in the air with what was going on. But a good friend of mine that's taught me a lot, or mentored me through into this practice, said, the problem is we're forcing the past as a solution set. But this is not a viable option. We need a new tool set. And so I said, yes, Design Unbound. I started rewriting Design Unbound completely with this mission in mind. I want to say that fortuitously, and especially since 2010, we have all sorts of new affordances that have emerged from the digital information revolution, and all of the way that fields like social sciences, political sciences, economics, all of the way different fields have begun to embrace some of these new tools. This is a list of some of them. I'll read them out. New models, game theory, agent-based modeling, has to be multiple model thinking. I'm sorry to the economists in the room. It's not just one kind of analysis. It's got to be multiple models looking at it from multiple perspectives. There's no one that would. I went to CASBIS, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, as an architect, a true anomaly in the system. And I got there and I thought, wow, these people are really smart. I'm going to learn a lot. I realized that every person there had the way they looked at the question that they asked about a complex problem. And so I began to understand that, as architects, we already understand from some of my examples, maybe you can understand, it's really we have to look at a lot of variables. Causal mapping on steroids. Networks, analyzed, mapped, and even architected. Yes, we can change the architecture of a network. And in doing so, change the way power flows. Money flows through that network. We can do that. Social sciences, this I got from the Carter Foundation. They're doing amazing stuff there. Social sciences reconceived, reality mining in real time, over time, micro-narratives for sentiment and anticipatory awareness, fuzzy cognitive maps, boundaries, probes, modulators, communication and transmedia campaigns, strategic game design, speculative design, world building, visualizing, communicating information across disparate domains. The reason why there's so many slides here is that everything's visual. I'm sorry. It's just, if I can't see it, I can't know it. And I think that's very important. I was talking with Tom. I gave him a metaphor, because I can't not be visual when he said one thing to me. AR, VR, XR, and all the blank R's. There's lots of those, the R's. And so here I already showed you one kind of causal map. This is very impactful for seeing the problem more. Well, this is another one. Doesn't matter that you can't read it. This is one about looking at terrorism, and they had to look at it through 3 lenses: the root causes of terrorism, individual motivations for becoming a terrorist, and terrorist organization decision-making. Like, you can have an organization and you can have individuals, but if they decide not to do anything, you're in better shape. So the notion of multiple models. Okay, but more than tools, we need to evolve a new practice. I referenced this before. Charles Lindblom, he presented his concept of muddling through a system of small, successive, incremental changes as the most effective approach for working on complex problems. When I heard that in a talk, I changed that whole talk as well and got very angry, because I'm sitting there in the audience going, no, we can do better now. We have to do better. And if we're not able to recognize that, then we are abrogating our responsibility. And that's very important. Okay. So, and it's more fun. So more than tools, we need a new practice to make these tools effective, one that orchestrates their use to work at the systems level of the problem to affect systemic change. That's what we need to do. All of my learning, and I'm going to say, because I may not have said it, it's an evolving practice. I'm not up here to tell you the way. This is my experience of what I've learned, and it's learned with people like you. It's all about listening and wondering and figuring out how do people make progress against all odds, and then trying to generalize it. So that's where this is coming from. This practice includes 2 things. So it's easy. I told you it's easy. Process of discovery to see more, better, faster. You're never going to see it all. More is good enough. You're never going to see it perfectly. Better is good enough. And faster, so we don't say, oh, well, okay, I'll get back to you in 3 years, when the decision has to be made today in the white water, okay? So you have to build skills. So this is in order to give us more optics for a better approach, which is the second part. And then alternative planning that designs a steering framework for emergent change, an ecology of mechanisms and actions that steer change by influencing emergent systemic behavior. Use the system. Affect it, know where to put things in that will cascade and scale. And the best part of this, those of you that do this work, know that if you're out there saying you're doing this work, the antibodies come out, and they're after you. And so believe me, I'm like a total alien in so many fields. I've been told that I can't have discussions with a certain person in front of many students because I don't have a PhD in sociology. So the antibodies are out there. The goal here is to do it, to begin to get the network to do it. And then there's a point at which, tough luck. It's already happening. So the main thing first, I'm going to talk about the first part first, is we need to have the ability to look at any object and see the way in which it is changed by connection and by entanglement. Whether you're commanding an army, running a Fortune 500 company, creating an extraction mining policy protocol, as Obi talked about, planning a great work of art, thinking about your child's education, running an interdisciplinary research lab, or steering the future of work. All of these, I want to say, agency today is not just changing the world, it's working in the world. And if what matters to you are raising those 2, 3 amazing kids, you still need to know how to have agency. How do you run the work with the PTA, right? You really, this notion of agency is really, really, how do you get, when the doctor tells you that something is wrong with your kid and that's not what it is and you know it, how do you work in these systems, okay? I want to emphasize them. That's at any scale. I also want to say we have different comfort levels. Some of us want to work on the world, some of us just want to work in it, and we have different scales. So this is about seeing for understanding. So more than things and problems, we need to read context in which these things and problems exist. We need to read the systems. If you haven't heard the word systems enough, I just will continue to drive it home. So we need new tools, we need new methods of discovery, analysis, design, new skills and capacities, but we need our old operating, if we're going to see more, better, and faster, I want to say first, our old operating frames are insufficient. We really need a new way to look at things. We need a new world view. So I'm actually doing epistemology before I'm doing practice. We need a new epistemological foundation. Very easy. We know Newtonian. We know the Newtonian window on the world works. It provided us with tools to think about the interaction of things and forces, orderly clockwork, universe wound up by his famous 3 laws. These were very important for us when Newton brought these up. This was the beginning of the Enlightenment. This is very important to have understanding, and they still work as they did before. But there was a moment at which they weren't answering a lot of questions. We were stuck with, okay, and so Darwinian sciences proposed a kind of second window or epistemological frame that marked a critical shift. He was telling us that living systems arise not out of immutable laws, but that regulate all physical order, but rather as the result of natural processes that create living order out of abundant chaos. And process is now more important than law in shaping these systems. But while shifting from Newton to Darwin, although it's a plus, is productively headed in the right direction, it's really only a partial journey because there are lots of things it can't talk about. It doesn't talk about novelty. It doesn't show us how, might talk about the individual species development, but it doesn't talk about why do birds flock, right? It doesn't talk about how complex behavior comes out of simple interactions. And so Ludwig von Bertalanffy, I can't forget his name, he came up with general system theory. And Herbert Simon, his Sciences of the Artificial. And then the first papers of the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity came out. You'll notice the others were single men. We're doing a little better. This is a group of men. But the idea that complexity science did not arise out of a singular thing. It actually happened when a lot of people were noticing things they couldn't explain, like birds flocking, like virals, like fungus, all sorts of things. And I don't know what to do with it, put it on the shelf. And then the computer scientists were saying, I don't know what to do with that, put it on the shelf. And then you had lots of different fields, ecologists, I don't know what to do with that, put it on the shelf. And then all of a sudden we began to have computation where we could look at patterns. We could then see anomalies against patterns. We found tipping points. We found attractors, dynamic things that attract other things. And we now have complexity science. And I'm going to suggest that this third window, framed by complex adaptive systems from multiple perspectives, but that the ecological perspective is the most valuable because it seems to include everything else, including biology and all of the others. So it has to do with interdependencies, chance, novel perturbations, et cetera, et cetera. This gives us a new lens for us to look at the world. complex systems, I'm not going to go into this for sake of time, but this will be available. It talks about some of the rules of complex systems. I don't know about you, but there's a lot being thrown around about complexity and complex systems today. But you got to really dig deep. Understanding it is different than using the terminology. That's why I was so brilliant what you did yesterday. I was so if I could say I was so proud, but that's the wrong thing, the wrong words to use. So we have good theories from understanding complex systems, from really bright people in lots of different fields beginning to generate this understanding. But I will say that most of complex systems theory is for understanding. It's not for action. And that's where I find it begins to fall short for me. Lots of brilliant people like Casbus talking about what the problem is with the economics model. What would be the brief for a new moral economy, but not how to do it. And so this is my interest. How do you do it? Okay. So I'm suggesting we just need an epistemological shift. We need a tri-worldview. That's all. And we have it. We have the means. Okay. In this world, we cannot design for a fixed solution or end state. Now I'm bringing up the idea of designing for emergence. We need to design for emergent change. The objective is to attain some ability to steer the complex system. But then the question is, how do we steer a system through a complex tangle web of interactions? That's where I come in. So how do we design for emergence? Designing for emergence is about shaping change by inserting designed components and systems of components. By components, it could be things like policies, a curriculum, but it can be actions. It could be a transmedia campaign. A system of components that together, in their exchanges, do more than any could do alone. And most of those components don't have to be top-down. But they probably have to be both, because policies have to often clear the way for actions that go against the policy. Okay? So we're trying to steer a system in its ongoing self-organization. The water's running. You don't stop it, tie it up neatly, and send it on its way. It's running. How do you put the rocks in? The one rock, well, that steers it a little bit. How do you put the system of rocks into the water to organize it differently? So designing for emergence is shorthand for designing for emergent behavior in complex systems, those systems that are manifest and driven by emergent. So now we get really concrete. This is the practice as I see it. This is a diagram for a potential way to look at it. The conventional approach for working on complex problems, which comes from my friend, is that there's a first part, you analyze the problem space. And also, working at RAND has taught me a lot, because if you know the RAND Corporation, they are a think tank that really is behind many of the government's decision-making. They were behind the mutually assured destruction policy. Good and bad, they're behind a lot of this. So I've learned a lot from them. So it's about analyzing the problem space. You get experts in to help us with what we know, proceeding through reductionist reasoning. You break the problem apart. Different experts get different parts of the problem, take the test apart, get different work on it. And you prioritize usually what you can solve for. There's this notion of externalities, but we all know that when you're working on complex problems, it's the externalities that come back to bite you. It's the things that you say, I can't deal with the people part, so I will do this. And then the people part comes back and bites you, or breaks your legs usually, and more. Complex problems are not solvable. So analyzing, prioritizing, breaking apart, solving pieces is not going to work. Then you come up with a decision, a policy, or a strategic plan to implement it. This is not, the next part is a quote. My friend Ren says, you just call a meeting. He says in Washington right now, complex problems are there. This was a week ago. This is a quote from a week ago. You call a meeting. You call 2 meetings. You write a memo. You might do some scenario planning. You might do some red teaming. But usually it's call a meeting, call 2 meetings. It's going too fast. Write a report, write a memo, and then implement a policy or program, and you're done. Right? And that's the way it's working. So I'm going to suggest a different approach, which is understanding the problem space. Remember I said those 2 things before. But now you need to dive much deeper. you need to go through this process of discovery that looks 360 degrees, vertically, horizontally, through time, through time. Where was it before? Where is it now? Not where is it going? You should go where is it going, but where do we want it to go? Okay, this is really, really important. And I said there are new tools for this, and new methods. And then you want to steer towards a better future. You want to leapfrog traditional methods, employing tools that scaffold the pragmatic imagination for out of the box, beyond the box. There is no box thinking, right? And then developing ecologies, what I call ecologies of change and action. And you can do this to create progress on some of the most intractable societal problems, to identify and take issues off the table before they go white hot. This is my friend, again, a week ago, and he said, here, I'm going to send you a whole bunch. Pick the ones you want. We'll stand this up and start this. And get better at making decisions in white hots. The space of operation is this one. It's the intersection of complexity science from a socio-technical perspective, the tools that come with it, the thinking that comes with it, the concepts that come with it, the methods that come with it. Architecture as contexts, we'll talk about that very quickly, and new tools, platforms, and technologies that are out there and that we can invent. So why architecture? Because architecture is an empirical plus visual, science plus humanities, problem-solving plus creative, innovative practice. It's more than just designing buildings as things. It's about designing buildings that are contexts as containers for complex interactions of human systems and human life. This is how I came to this. When I started at UW, and I go, it was very funny because when we started this notion of 4 constituencies that don't get along, all the men were saying, but they're women, they're going to get along. And I'm like, you didn't grow up with sisters, right? So this notion of so more than a single building, an ensemble of buildings, how do you go up one more level of abstraction to think about designing contexts in which things are inside of it, like curriculums and policies and whatever, but it's the context you're trying to change. Additionally, what's interesting is architecture was a science arising out of many other sciences, and it was adorned with much and varied learning. It has at its hands already an integrated suite of tools that have unique purchase on doing work from a radically multidisciplinary science plus humanities perspective. We have to take so many constraints, climate, technology, social systems, the clients, all of the aspects, and we don't just analyze it and say, here's the problem, haha, it's yours, not mine. We actually have to design a resolute thing, something. And that's so there's embedded in our practice, there's already a way to, I don't know about you, but if you've worked on radically multidisciplinary problems, sometimes everybody gets in the room and you're talking past each other, right? We love to talk about this and problem-based learning, but you really need visual tools and practices to take both spoken vernaculars, tools, vernacular tools, and visual vernaculars, and begin to make them productive. So we have a purchase on that already. Okay. So you can't see this, but you can have this slide. This is my friend John C. Brown's favorite slide. He said, you could give the whole lecture just around this slide. Oh. You know, it's like, this is hot off the press. These are the tools that belong to those different domains that we are using in this practice. And by we, I mean a practice that has evolved with my work in studios. We've created policy and action studios to work on some pretty intractable problems. That amazing work has come out of it at Party Ran. When we started, it was nothing. 5 years later, by working this through and pulling in powerful tools and going to lots of places like this to find new tools and find new people and networks, this is what it's been emerging from. You'll notice that on the left, there's a bracketed set of tools that point to the blue dot in the middle. So these are tools that have actually evolved and grown up in this new space of operation that we've done. So this might be an example of a practice pathway on a wicked problem. A, So the but is in there. It's a practice pathway. So in this one, I will read it to you. For understanding the problem space, when we've been doing this recently, the problems we've been working on, this, how do you mine stories on the ground of, from 3,000 people to get, if you're going to look for patterns and anomalies, you need 3,000 people, you don't need a sampling. You need to you don't find anomalies in a small family. And precedents. Causal inference diagrams on steroids is the second part. You break apart the problem, put down what you know, then you go back out and you begin to look for sentiment, motivation analysis. Why do people do what they do, so that you can really begin to test out your causal diagrams. I'm making this sound formulaic. It's like so not me, because this is really a messy process. Then you need to map the problem space through multiple models. The big deal is in the middle when you reframe it, when you widen the aperture. I talked about how I reframed the AUW. I talked about how we reframed the Guecho project, how Abreu reframed what he was doing. You change the story, the vision, the narrative. World building, which I'm not going to talk about today, but a very powerful way to begin to work towards desirable futures. We're all stuck in the tyranny of the present. When you work on wicked problems, most people go, okay, I'm going to look for a better state 20 years out, but you're stuck in what now looks like. You need to use some radical new ways to go beyond what now looks like and just project it outward. You need to leapfrog 20 years out and go, okay, fine. And everybody says, no, but that won't work. It's not pragmatic. You can't get there. You go, yeah, but that's what we're aiming at. Until you have what you're aiming at, and you look at where you are, then you go, fine, I need to get from A to B, right? We all know making maps. That's where this next part comes in, which is the ecologies of change. It's the ecologies of change that get us from A to B, the designing for emergence, steering change. I skipped over a really important one, mapping the system across actors and flows. How does the money flow? How does power flow? How does influence flow? There's often influence and not power. Mapping those flows. How does the policy propagate through the system? And we have the people that do that. They started in terrorism, and now they've got better things to do. And then landing the mechanisms. Not creating a strategic plan, not implementing it, not just buying 5 different tanks and 4 different this, but landing it. How do you do that? These are the really powerful ones. The only ones I'm going to talk about are ecologies of change, because my first 3 stories were about ecologies of change. This is a very quick little thing, but I want to show you concretely how we can talk about these as ecologies of change. There are 2 main mechanisms meta-mechanisms in the book Design Unbound. One is called a system of action. The other is called the Change Triangle 3.0. There's a difference between them. Systems of action is what you do when you do not have access to power at the top, when you have to work inside the system. The 3 examples I showed you had to be systems of action. Doesn't mean that you don't use the networks, but you don't really have access. The change triangle is when you have access to power at the top. You are either at the top, trying to change your organization or your institution. This is what we did with Jack DeGioia and Rand, but it's different. Both of these require top and bottom. It's never one or the other. It's just that one principally can be done when you don't have access. Okay, ecologies of change. I'm merely going to talk about what they are. It's a set of interdependent, interactive, and intercatalytic mechanisms. Interdependent, interactive, they work together, and intercatalytic, they force each other's work. Like, it's not a piston engine. It's an ecology where what I do makes you better and what you do makes me better. Intercatalytic mechanisms and actions that steer change by influencing the emergent systemic behavior. That's what it is. So the only one I want to talk about are the lessons I extracted and the system of action, which are collections of interrelated components that work from inside the system. They're meant to be transformative, and they're meant to scale through emergence. There are 5 components. There could be 6. None of this is a formula, but there seem to be 5 that one has to pay attention to: vision, vehicle, concept, mechanisms, and a network of partners. So in Elsi Stemma, just going to run through them quickly, what was the vision? The vision was to create social reform by focusing on one of the most intractable problems of urban life in Venezuela, to give the most vulnerable children a path to empowerment. It wasn't to change the government, and it wasn't to teach music. It was about an intractable problem. The vehicle was music. That was the vehicle. A vehicle is to get from A to B. So he said, I'm going to use music. I'm going to use tourism. I'm going to use whatever. That's the vehicle. But the concept is really critical, to build orchestras and choirs, but not simply teach music to children, and a whole system to support these orchestras and choirs. The network of partners was really important. As I said, he built it deep within Venezuelan society in dialogue with the state, multilateral institutions, and key influential individuals. And mechanisms, things that do work in the system together. The school as a safe space was a mechanism. It got the work it did is it got the kids off the street and gave them a safe place to be. The orchestras and choirs, it brought them together to listen to each other and work together and think about more. The white shirts got the families involved and gave the kids a sense of belonging and a certain kind of a pride or dignity. Paper instruments, the music out of folk songs, local concerts. The advanced students teach the younger students. The White Gloves Choir, the National Youth Orchestra, these are mechanisms and they work together. And here I've simply mapped them to show how they work together. Some of them work more on the empowerment ambition side, that's the top. Some of them about safety, get the safety first. Every day, the schoolyard is a safe place. Some of them prioritize the individual level. The advanced students teach the younger students. Some of them prioritize, or some of them are part of the community. I don't mean prioritize. The local concert, the music from folk songs. So when you get good at this, you begin to map them. And if you're trying to do it conscientiously, you might actually make a framework in which to do it, which is I showed you the AUW framework. Okay, AUW, vision, 3 scales. Individual empowerment, regional transformation, and a network of bridges. That was the vision. The vehicle was higher education, but that is where they started. That was their vision, higher education for 500 women a year. Really important, but not big enough. Concept, to do liberal arts, plus a professional and graduate programs, and women from 13 Southeast Asian countries. The mechanisms were many. A new kind of hybrid pedagogical program, a robust alumni network, global mentoring, master planning, architecture, lots of things that broke rules, and a network of partners, which I've talked about, a vast network across the world, academic partners, governing, funding partners, industry partners, other academic ones, and geopolitical, and so you can map those as well. I'm not going to go through it again, but you can map them. Keough was also, the vision was economic and human development in one of the poorest and overlooked provinces in China. The vehicle was cultural tourism, but the concept, again, vehicle wasn't big enough. The concept was an ecosystem for the teaching of crafts and the idea of an itinerary. So it wasn't just that the vehicle wasn't big enough, the way it was being conceived was harmful, extremely harmful. What we proposed was something that would hopefully not be harmful, but would also sustain what was being lost because of the generations that they were losing to the city. The ability to bring the middle generation back. And mechanisms, which I talked about those as many as well, which I won't repeat again. And a network of partners, which I also said started very well. We started with an amazing group of people, including the dean of the tourism school. It was so great because she was so politically connected, but then she was so good at it. She went into politics and lost the ability to focus on this. Okay, I'm essentially done. But there is a second meta mechanism I just want to tell you about, which is the change triangle. And I said before that the change triangle 3.0 is when you really have access to power at the top. The main thing with that one is you have to really understand all of the micro narratives, all of the bottom. You have to, and there's a whole set of chapters on this and examples in my book. There is a role for the imagination. It's really, really important. we need to have the ability to look at any object and see the way in which it is changed by entanglement. But we need to see, or we just see for understanding. It's not enough seeing for understanding. We need to see with the imagination. Most of us are stuck in the tyranny of the possible. We know what we know, and we do what we can do. We might make incremental change off of that, but only the imagination and permission to be non-practical, to go beyond what you think will happen, or worse, know what will happen, because I did the model, right? And we need to be able to see otherwise. And many of the tools that we've developed, especially world building, are all about that. How do you begin to not just see a concept, but the whole world that might arise out of that concept? So it's not abstract. It creates a desire to be there. Because in a world that's rapidly changing, we need improvisation, that's the imagination, the need for adaptability and resilience. In a world that's broadly connected, we need, with increasing heterogeneity, we need to imagine oneself in another's shoes. More wicked problems are bigger and more intractable. We need to imagine the corners of the problem that we can't see. We need an empathetic imagination to put ourselves, to not just not sympathize, but put ourselves in another's shoes and ask why? What's the motivations? And in a world that's radically contingent, problems and opportunities are contingent on contexts that are always changing. Complex problems are contingent on other complex problems. Opportunities are contingent on other opportunities. I love to talk about not just unintended consequences, but unintended opportunities. What's the opportunity that you missed? And that's what you reframe around and go from there. Because of this, the imagination is more critical than usual, but we're experiencing a true crisis of imagination. And if we had audio, I would play for you this very small video clip, which talks about the failure of imagination that led to 9/11. Okay. If you're interested in the imagination, we pulled one chapter out of Design Unbound and put it out first, which is about the imagination as a muscle, not as something that some people have and others don't have. It's a muscle. We all have it as children, and many of those muscles atrophy and a lot of it has to do with the way education is done. So if you're interested in looking at the imagination of the muscle and some ways to get it going, there's that book. Okay. There's only one last little part. There's 3 slides. I promised you that this was really easy, but we needed a new ontology. I'm not sure what that ontology is, but I'm going to make a few suggestions. This is a quote that I love by Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena. If a mirror does not reflect your own likeness, it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. This has to do with understanding the world as a pluriverse of many others. And if you don't see yourself in them, it doesn't mean they're not there. And this is such a legacy of colonialism. It doesn't mean they're not there, and it doesn't mean that the reflection isn't detailed, nuanced, and important to see. So I'm going to suggest that this new ontology is built around radical empathy and the pluriverse. So and the idea of multiple worldings. I'm just going to explain this very quickly. This notion of a pluriverse is heterogeneous worldings coming together. Worldings is the building of worlds. And the reason it's such a beautiful terminology is that it has to do with worlds of the mind and worlds in reality and culture. It's all the things we do as humanity. We build our worlds. As families, we build worlds. This is what we do. But this is about heterogeneous worldings coming together as a political ecology of practices. Here, by politics, I don't mean a political system. I mean the root idea of convening out of an area of interest. This is not about a return, as Obi said. This is about a reboot. And can we create a reboot as a heterogeneous worldings political ecology of practices that negotiate the difficult being together. And this isn't just us, humanity. This is the planet as an agent in its own worlding. This is multi-species recognition as well. Can we do that? Can we reboot based upon the pluriverse of multiple worldings, which requires radical empathy? I just wanted to throw this in here. I don't know if you've heard of the two mountains analogy. I think Obi was challenging yesterday about what gives us hope. The one thing that gives me hope is that this metaphor came out of an economist, famous economist and historian of economics. And I'm not going to read his quote, but he talks about the fact that there were always two mountains there, but one mountain was really steep and shrouded in clouds, and worse than that, you had to hack your way to the bottom of it. It was a jungle. It was all entangled and messy. And so this is him as an economist saying, so we economists went up the first mountain. It was knowable. We saw it. We could see the top. We knew how to climb it, and we had the tools to climb it, moreover. And when we got to the top of this mountain and we look at the other mountain, we go, oh, that's where we should have gone. The first one is linear. The second one is he calls it its complexity economics. And that's where we should have gone, because from there we would have really seen the world better. And then he says, but the problem is, to get to that one, we have to go down first, unlearning, and we have to have new tools to move up the other mountain and hack through the forest. It gives me hope that because the kind of, I love economists, this is not me dissing, but it has been fundamental to the way that we've constructed society over the past century and a half. It is the basis of inventing the corporation, which the invention of the corporation, not the making money, not the doing good things, not the building of cars, not all the things that corporations do, but the invention of the corporation has us stuck and stagnated. And I think, so this idea that this notion of a second mountain, that's why I'm building a base camp at the second mountain, that gives me hope. That's what gives me hope, and all the things that we do. So if you like, I was born in the Midwest. If you were born here, the storms are so amazing in the Midwest, the storms on the horizon. This is a tornado. This is my last slide. So if the leadership of the world is missing in action, as Obi says, if the politics of the world is broken, how do we design a new multilateral order while also steering us through the storm clouds? We can't just go, okay, put it on hold, right? I agree with Obi that it will be outside the traditional system, and that we need to approach this as an opportunity not to return, but to reset. And I suggest that we need each other, and we need no fear. Thank you.